next up, we're going to do the first roundtable discussion. So if I could have Casey, Brian, Tim, Dan, and Jennifer, and Tom come up, please. All right, so I will ask you guys to reintroduce yourselves when we get to the first question, but I do want to just kind of introduce this roundtable discussion. Tom kind of touched on this a little bit, but so each of these treatments that we're doing, as we all know, it's a silvicultural activity that we're doing on the ground. And, you know, it's important to know the silvics of the species that you're working with and the ecology of the system that you're working in. But you really have to know what the landowner or the land manager objectives are, what they want. Sometimes those objectives are simply, they don't want fire into communities, but also sometimes it could be a wildlife objective or aesthetic objective, recreation, or a number of different things. These fuels projects could meet lots of different objectives. So we put this panel together, kind of a cross-section of agencies, and knowing that we're all resource agencies, but we all have different objectives in terms of what we're trying to do on our landscapes. So came up with a bunch of questions, and this is not strict. We don't have to stick with these questions. I said in the email to you guys, but just to help guide this this discussion, I came up with some questions, and I asked these folks to kind of give a perspective on it. So, but first, I'll ask you to just reintroduce yourself so everybody knows who you're working for and what agency you represent, and what your position is on in your agency.
Good morning. I'm Jennifer Barnes. I'm with the National Park Service. I'm the regional fire ecologist, and I'm based here in Fairbanks.
Good morning, Brian Haugen, Fire Management Specialist, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service here in Fairbanks.
I'm Dan Rees. This panel, I represent two entities. First entity, I'm a forester for the Army in Alaska, so Fort Wainwright, Fairbanks area, and Delta Junction area. And the second, I'm a private landowner, so I have a farm in the Eielson Ag Field Projects, south of Fairbanks and near Salta, Eielson Air Force Base. I raise cattle, hogs. I grow horticultural plants, landscape trees, sell vegetables. An 80-acre farm, 20 acres of it is forested, and of that, so I have a forest stewardship plan. I worked at the Division of Forestry about 20 years ago, and I've been fully implementing that plan. I represent private land. I'm Casey Baselug. I'm the BLM State Fuels Program Lead, and be around here in Fairbanks.
Yeah, I'm Tim Mowry. I'm currently working for the Department of Fish and Game, but I served as the statewide public information officer for the Division of Forestry for 7.5 years. And just recently moved over, sort of communications.
Tom St. Clair was just talking to you about. I'm here for the Bureau of Indian Affairs. I'm the Regional Fire Management Officer for the Alaska region.
All right, and I, again, am Jeremy Douse, and I work for the Division of Forestry as the Northern Region Forester, and I'm the land manager for the Tanana Valley State Forest, and the jurisdictional agency administrator for fires on state land and municipal lands within the Northern region. So I'll be adding to the discussion a little bit here too. Okay, so but for the first question, I was hoping to ask everybody to begin by describing the overarching mission of the agency that you represent. And I guess we'll go in reverse order this time. So Tom, if you could start by just describing your overarching mission of your agency, not just fire, but the resource mission of your agency and fire.
Oh, all right. Well, Bureau of Indian Affairs has a pretty broad-reaching mission. I think generally, as far as land management goes, we're talking about trust resources. And so specifically in Alaska, those trust resources are native town site lots, which are small and usually in the villages, and native allotments, which are typically 160 acres or less, and some of them are being subdivided, so there's starting to be more of them, although some of them are also being converted to fee simple land and sold, and some new ones are still coming out there. And then I guess there's a third category, which is the current administration that really wants us to push for fee to trust, which would be opportunities for tribes to move land into trust status. And so I guess bottom line for fire is that we protect these lands from fire because of the federal government's relationship with the allottees, and EIA is charged with sort of making sure that happens through all the agreements. Alaska Fire Service is our fire department, and they have an agreement with the DNR and the U.S. Forest Service to do the work in certain parts of the state. So, yeah, we have much broader than land management. Bureau of Indian Affairs has education, law enforcement, all these different programs for the tribes. So,
Yeah, and there's probably people in this room that can better answer this question than I, but for Division of Forestry, we protect over 150 million acres from a fire standpoint, have protection responsibility for over 150 million acres in Alaska. Most of that is the roaded system, you know, the urban communities all through South Central Alaska, pretty much all the roads in the interior. So, and then from a resource, and we have area offices spread throughout the state, you know, stretching from Kenai to McGrath to Fairbanks. So, and from a resource perspective, you know, we're trying to manage for a sustainable forest in Alaska and trying to make timber harvest opportunities available for the public and for companies. And we have 3 state forests in Alaska: Kenai Valley State Forest, Southeast State Forest, and King State Forest, I believe. So we also administer timber sales for other entities, University of Alaska, Mental Health Trust. Don't have capacity to do that. We also assist the U.S. Forest Service with the funds of the U.S. Forest Service to do inventory work for them around the state, which we've been doing for several years now. It's just another. That's just Chris or Jeremy chime in.
So I'll speak for the BLM. So BLM in Alaska kind of has 2 primary missions. The first one would be the BLM side of things. And so their on paper mission is to sustain health, diversity, and productivity of public land for the use of enjoyment for present and future generations. It's more of a multi-use mission, going from range to oil and gas to wild horse burrow to wildlife, forestry, subsurface mining, stuff like that. And part of that is also fire management. So in Alaska, it's Alaska Fire Service, which has a different kind of mission, and their mission is to provide safe, cost-effective fire suppression for all the GOI and native lands within Alaska. And through agreement, the Division of Forestry, they basically have like the South half, and AFS has the North half of the state Forest Service. So kind of a 2-tiered mission within Alaska. Mission of the Army is we're not a multi-use agency. Our primary purpose is to train soldiers to conduct military missions around the world. So pretty straightforward. Separate my private property with something.
Yeah, so Fish and Wildlife Service. The book answer is mission is to conserve fish, wildlife, plants, and their habitats. That's the book answer. Part of that is also working with others and working with neighbors. Fish and Wildlife Service has some large blocks of land up in Alaska. But even with those large blocks of land, there are plenty of other entities that are involved and they encompass with that or that we touch their lands. You move down to the lower 48, we have a lot of pretty relatively small pieces of land that butt up against private land most of the time. Is kind of that relationship that we have down lower 48, working with private landowners and either burning alongside them or letting, having their land maybe have a piece of that fire as well, has kind of bought us a lot in the last like 25 years in building that relationship. Probably more so than anything else is fire is connected the Fish and Wildlife Service to the people. That's
Okay, so the mission for the National Park Service is very much conservation oriented. It's to preserve unimpaired the natural and cultural resources and values of the National Park Service system for enjoyment, education, and inspiration of this and future generations. So it's very much preserved and unimpaired, which when you start doing fuels treatments can sometimes run into conflicts of interest, but I think people with all the fires that have been going on understand the need for fuels treatments. We also have a mission for the fire program, which is the mission of the National Park Service Wildland Fire Program, is to manage wildland fire, to protect the public, park communities, and infrastructure, conserve natural and cultural resources, and maintain and restore natural ecosystem processes. Within Alaska, we definitely look towards those natural ecosystem processes, and a lot of our fire management plans address the natural process of fire in our systems. And so we've often looked at, we want to maintain fire on the landscape, but then we also need to protect our infrastructure in our park communities and in places that people are living for historic cultural values.
Private landowner. So I live on the property. It's hard to envision what a mission is. Still want to continue to live there. It's my mission. As a farm, we supply food to the community. I think my wife and I would agree that's probably a mission for a farm. The forest lands, we manage that for supply firewood that we burn. That's how we feed our home. The aesthetic value of having the forest and wildlife habitat.
And Dan, correct me if I'm wrong, but one mission probably is to be profitable with your land, right? Is that not a reality in interior Alaska? Okay, gotcha. And for you online, Dan said that they strive for it, but so I did actually. Well, I'm gonna finish up. Tim, you did a great job with the division, the mission of the division. I'm gonna add a couple things. I think we're, because we are also a protection agency, much like BLM. We have, so on our website, our mission statement says to develop, conserve, and enhance Alaska's forests to provide a sustainable supply of forest resources for Alaskans. I think that does a pretty poor job of, it does a great job of describing our mission for the resource side of the division, but it doesn't really describe what the protection side of the division does. We consider ourselves Alaska's fire department. I would say that, well, there's a goal on the website, says that to provide safe, cost-effective, and efficient fire protection services, related fire and aviation management activities on state, private, and municipal lands, and then lands negotiated. So that definitely states what it is, but what the values that we're trying to protect are communities, Alaskans. I would say that this is obviously debatable, but the mission of the division is to mitigate negative impacts of wildland fire on Alaskans and Alaskan people. That's just Jeremy Douse saying that. That's not the division, but that's what it looks like from my perspective. And I'm going to go off script a little bit and key in on Tim. Because in your role as a public information officer, what do you feel like is dealing with the public? what do you think that their perspective of public agencies fuel fire mitigation mission? Do you feel like it's been successful, or do you feel like what is their opinion of it?
Yeah, so I think for the most part, yeah, I think the public sort of reveres firefighters. They see the firefighters in yellow and green and look at them as, you hear the word heroes tossed around a lot, but you know, we wear white hats, sort of. You know, they are very responsive to that boots on the ground sort of presence. And I think recently, you know, 2014, we had the Sockeye fire in 2015. We had the Kinley fire in 2019. Those were really eye-opening events for public. Alaska, we're not like California. We're not like what's going on in New Mexico. Right? We don't typically burn houses down. Alaska's, we all know Alaska's a huge place, but for the public to see 50 houses go up, you know, homes go up in the Sockeye fire, 50 plus homes go up in the Kinley fire in a matter of a day, really, I think, wakes people up. And those are sort of the moments that you seize on from an agency to educational moments for the community, because it's like anything else, you know, once you have a couple slow fire seasons, people forget about wildfire until they smell smoke in the air. But for the most part, I think the public is really receptive to what we're doing. They don't, they mainly have good things to say about firefighters, not just from the Division of Forestry, but from BLM, from the U.S. Forest Service. I think it's a little difficult for the public to understand, because it is of such an interagency nature, to understand sort of how fire management works in Alaska. That's sort of a continual challenge from a communication standpoint, is trying to educate the public about how we do things, and that different agencies in Alaska that are doing this. Just trying to educate them not only about FireWise, but you know why we would want to let some fires burn. So it's a sticky point. You know, a couple of years ago, the last year, the Munson Creek fire was sort of a big deal. It's right in Fairbanks' backyard. It's in a limited option area, but you've got a tourist destination right there that was impacted and threatened. You've got homes that are, you know, potentially threatened, evacuation alerts and notices, and yet we're letting this fire burn. So there's sort of a conflict there when you're issuing evacuation orders and you're still. So that's sort of a hard sell to the public, and it takes sort of continual education to get them there. But for the most part, I think the public is really supportive about what we're doing. And I think it's really imperative on the agencies to be transparent about what we're doing, why we're letting the fire burn, or why we want to put this fuel break in the backyards of people in Fox. Like that.
Does. Thanks, Tim. And also, I want to open it. Anybody can ask any question at any time. If one of the panelists says something that kind of makes you think something, you want to ask a question or make a comment, please do. You're more than welcome to do so. But, that goes online too, and you can use that chat function if you have any questions. All right, so the second question from the script is, if one exists, describe your agency's local fuels program and how it functions. And I have some examples of how many people you have working, if it's mostly a staff-oriented program, or if you use contracts or cooperators, or just in any way describe if you have a fuels program, and if so, what it looks like.
So currently with the Park Service, we hire seasonal fuels crews, and that usually, so we've got two area programs, one in based in Denali and one based in Fairbanks, and they serve multiple parks. And that usually they have 4 to 5 seasonal positions. We currently have a new fire specialist, which is kind of a fuels person that was hired to supervise these crews. And then we've also put in money towards an IAA with the BLM, where we utilize people from that have more staff to go and do work. We've got some work down in Katmai that was helped by the smoke jumpers last fall. And then we've also done contracts. We haven't done any in a long time. I think the biggest one we did was around the Denali headquarters where we had a contract. We've also hired TCC crews to do some of our work, and we've used SCAs. So, but most of our fuels projects are more kind of a point source around cabins, but we do have some bigger areas around headquarter infrastructure where we have larger areas that are being thinned out. What else did you have on there?
So for the Fish and Wildlife Service in Alaska, up here up north, in my district, we're pretty skinny. We have fuel specialist, and that's about all the horsepower we have. So when we want to get a project done, we go about it either a couple of ways. We tap into a cooperative agreement. So that's where we funnel money to, say, Fort Yukon, and they provide the labor, and we provide the dollars. That's probably that's one way to get it done. It's not the perfect answer, but it certainly works. The other way, we have brought in some detailers that come up and will help us with relatively small projects like clearing out around a public use cabin, firewise. The remoteness of those is usually bush plane, so we're flying in 185 at most. So we have 2-3 people at most that we can safely and effectively get in and out of those spots. So that's pretty small scale. Now moving down to the Kenai Refuge, now that's a different game down there. So they have a fuel specialist and a bunch of equipment that they can utilize and tap into. And they've been getting a lot of stuff done in cooperation with a bunch of government entities and NGOs. And they are currently standing up a 6-person fuels module down there that's going to give them a little extra capacity. From what I understand, they have 3 of those 6 positions hired, not necessarily in place, but the process has begun. So that's going to look a little different down there for Fish and Wildlife Service. Those guys have been using a lot of Forest Service detailers. I know some smoke jumpers to help them kind of complete their projects. It might be a little bit more self-sustaining once that fuels module gets stood up.
The fuels program for the Army is pretty extensive. For Wainwright, remember our mission is to train soldiers. Wildfires or the threat of wildfires restrict that training. So we have pretty good support to implement fuels management. So our internal Army staff for fuels management is basically me, but we rely heavily on other entities. So cooperative agreements with Bureau of Land Management, Alaska Fire Service is probably our primary method for staff managed fuels. We also have a lot of cooperative agreements with local state of Alaska, soil and water conservation districts, and various universities. So when in our strategy on the landscape is we have an aggressive prescribed fire program where we do live fire training. Alaska Fire Service does that for us. We nominally burn around 50,000 acres annually. We rotate 5-year assessment of all of our structures on Army land, basically implementing Firewise on that. And then we have about 360-mile fuel brake system across Army lands with a focus on basically keeping fires from moving off the insulation onto adjacent private property and state lands. So kind of maintaining all that is definitely a team approach and using a lot of popular agreements.
All right, so for the BLM, our primary or our kind of historic fuels program lies within the military zone, as Dan mentioned. Do a lot of continue to do a lot of burning for the military there to support their primary mission. So moving forward, we have direction from the National Office Washington to build capacity and start doing more fuels work around the nation. That includes Alaska. With that, we've really increased our fuels budget. From perspective, we started 2 years ago with about $750,000 2 years. So big increase in fuel dollars. So with that, requires staff. So we've been building staff within the BLM Alaska, both at the Alaska Fire Service, at the districts in Alaska that are outside of Alaska Fire Service Fire Protection. It started with kind of a handful of folks. That was mainly at the military zone. Looking at once we get the org chart filled and stuff. Pretty extensive increase in positions that comes along with an increase in base dollars to be able to do so. Some which is coming with the bipartisan infrastructure legislation, so it could run out in 2026, but it was a good start. Good struggle with that. So with that too, we've been adding some positions for the resource staff side of things at the districts, including like natural resource specialists, fire ecologists, looking at some wildlife ecologists. The national resource specialists, they're going to be kind of concentrating more on the agreements and contracting side of things. So we have been looking into several agreements with the state, certain areas, Delta West project, we've got that with an agreement with the state. Also Copper River area, there to doing an excellent job down there. 11 area, so pretty big effort. Also, when it gets down to doing work on the ground, again, contracting, as some of you might know that we shifted gears in the BLM side of things from the EFF program to the contractors. We have several of those in the state, and we're looking at getting those hired to do those work. Recently put out we'll be putting out bids for that, and so we hope to get that done. Park Service, we have agreement with them, so every once in a while they come and help us, but mostly we have agreement with them that way. We utilize the TCC crew, and we plan on this year as well to do some work, and so kind of whatever we can get on the ground work and also planning. We also do work pretty closely with the forestry program kids in here. But this position happens, so hopefully that program down. Firewood, thinning, hazardous removal, kind of, just to get out there kind of with how things are split up is the AFS, Alaska Fire Service, their primary mission is fuel. Non-BLM land, areas around communities, their mission of BLM is more so BLM. A lot more.
Thanks, Casey. Yeah, for Division of Forestry, we have, as Casey alluded to, everybody knows there's a big push nationwide for more fuels work amongst all the agencies, and we've seen that at DOF. Just in the last year, I think it was, we hired a statewide fuels coordinator, Darren Finley, which was a new position to sort of, just like the name implies, coordinate our fuels treatment efforts across the state. Historically, that was pretty much done by our area offices using WUI grants. They would apply for WUI grants, pick out fuels, potential fuels projects, and try to get grants to fund those projects. And it's really important because those grants provide work for the crews. When they're not on fires, they're working on project work, and we work, and we're adding more positions as we speak. I think we've hired 2 foresters, fuels foresters, one north of the range, one south of the range. Each one of our area offices, I believe, is getting a fuels person, a fuels tech that will be fuels and IA, sort of wearing multiple hats. But there's been a lot of funding coming in, I think, and we're getting funding from both, federal and state level. Gotten considerable support from the Alaska legislature, I think in the form of $17 million. I don't know if that's the total or if that's just state dollars. But so all of a sudden, like a lot of agencies, like money fell out of the sky into your lap. And now you've got to figure out what to do with it. And there are expectations that come with that money, as I think we'll talk about later. But we also, as Casey alluded to, we work with communities to develop CWPPs for their communities. That involves fuel breaks, Firewise, all that stuff. We work with boroughs. We have cooperative agreements set up with multiple boroughs: the Matthews Sitka Borough, Kenai Peninsula Borough, Fairbanks North Star Borough, to for various projects for fuels, trying to get money into the hands of the boroughs to provide, say, brush disposal sites that the public can bring their brush to get chipped or burned, so they're not burning it at home and risking, starting a fire. We've been focusing on sort of large scale fuel breaks in recent years. We've got the Sterling fuel break. We've got the old Murphy Dome fuel break that was constructed several years ago that we're doing maintenance on. We have other fuel breaks planned north of town, near Fox, 16-mile fuel break just north of Fox. And so it's really, there is a big push within the Division of Forestry to do fuels work. And I think at last count, when I left, we had 17 active projects, I believe, around the state, fuel projects that we're working on. A lot of it is trying to find a means to do that. When you're using crews, to do project work, that's slow and expensive. So we're sort of branching out into using contractors and trying to contract some of this work out so we can get it. I mean, putting in a 16-mile, 300-wide fuel break is not something a crew is going to do in a week. So those kind of projects require just more manpower, more horsepower, and that's where we're trying to get to. Trying to think of anything else. Darren would be really is the one that's spearheading this program, and as Jeremy mentioned earlier, our main objective is protecting communities, putting those fuel breaks around communities that can be used really as an anchor for firefighters to safely engage a fire that's moving toward a community. But yeah, got a lot of money coming in and trying to figure out productive and effective ways to use it. And I think that's going to be an ongoing process for the next several years.
Right. Thanks, Tim. So Indian Affairs, our program, we have part of me as the fire management officer, and we have one fuels program manager, and then we have a GIS specialist on staff. Largely what we do is we help the tribes and the tribal consortia or regional nonprofit plan their projects, and we fund some staff for some of the them, and those monies can be targeted towards the trust lands, the allotments, and the native town sites, which is our general fuels program. And then we have a couple of programs. This Reserve Treaty Rights Lands program. It's existed since about 2015, and it allows a federally recognized tribe to cooperate with other entities and propose a project on lands that they have an interest in. That's pretty neat because it can happen across ownership boundaries, and does put the tribes a little bit into the planning process more, since they're requesting the money and coming up with agreements with folks. And then this new legislation, I think some people have mentioned, have already put it up, bipartisan infrastructure law. That money is going to come down to us and other interior agencies with this language that allows folks to use it across boundaries more. And so with that and some of the other agency missions, some of our fuels projects are also just participating. Like the Park Service, for example, has some projects to put some lines in around some allotments that will enable there to be more fire on the landscape in their park. And so we do a lot of collaboration, cooperation, and supporting the tribal interests.
I just had one go back. You mentioned legislation, and that just triggered something. So we have also introduced a bill has been introduced in the legislature, and Jeremy would know better about the status of it, but I don't know if it's passed yet or not. The HB 255, or basically it's a bill to get our EFF crews. You know, right now we can only hire them to fight a fire. You know. So this legislation would enable us to bring crews on to do that project work, do fuels work. And one of the goals is that is a lot of times during fire season, our crews are engaged with fire, our agency crews. This would enable us to pull EFF crews out to do project work. And as what we're hoping would be a side benefit of that would be to boost the number of EFF crews, to give them more work opportunities, to make it more enticing to work. And I see Sarah with a hand up. 209. So that is going to be I'm not going to say a game changer, but it's a pretty big deal to be able to bring our EFF crews on to do project work, and try to really boost the number of, everybody knows the number of our EFF crews has really dwindled down to almost single digits over the last several years, and we're hoping this gives a little bit of a boost to that to get more folks involved in the program.
Fuels mission for a private property landowner. It's simple. I don't want my house and outbuildings burned down. So I mentioned working with Division of Forestry and their stewardship program, have a stewardship plan. That was 20 years ago, and I'm still implementing that plan. At that time, I didn't have enough trees around the house to qualify for the Firewise program, but I did qualify through stewardship for some timber stand improvement. My house is surrounded by black spruce, basically, predominantly black spruce. So working on a prescription to manage that. I also participated in natural resource conservation service programs, EQIP, Environmental Quality Incentive, and at the time also the WIP, Wildlife Habitat Incentive Programs. So kind of a combination of those funding sources allowed me to execute projects on my land to reduce fire danger, increase wildlife habitat, to meet the mission of what I want that land to do. And it's basically I'm cutting firewood and protecting my property.
All right, thank you. So do want to remind everybody that you have to hold the mic right to your face so that the people online can hear you. It's not, looks like there's a couple of messages where when you start going like this or moving your head around, they can't hear you. So it's got to be right in your face. COVID aware. All right. So I appreciate everybody's input on that. To me, it sounds like we all have fuels programs that are very collaborative in nature. We have to all work together to meet these objectives, even though we all have our own individual agency objectives. So I'm going to combine the next 3 questions into one question. So how does your local fuels program support the overarching mission of your agency at a programmatic level? And then, like, in answering that, think about what that specific values you're trying to protect on your landscape. And then think about what a perfect fuels project would look like if money and staffing were no object. Did I get that? And we can, you need to go back on the question. I can help out. All right, here we go.
Wow, that's a lot. So in my simple mind, Indian Affairs is looking out for the people, right? And so whatever their needs are, they articulate to us, and often their tribal government would be the mechanism for that. Except for the trust lands are a little different. They belong to the allottees and they have a restricted title of the allotments, and we're supposed to protect them in perpetuity so that there's multiple allottees and then their kids and future generations that we have to think about, and we just don't have a landscape. So I think we need to protect those allotments from fire, and in the timber, it makes a lot of sense to do a small collaborative project if the adjacent landowner wants to have ecological fire processes happening on the allotment. It also makes a lot of sense for us to continue. We've been working with Alaska Fire Service in the Upper Yukon zone, especially, and Brian Haugen over there to try and get the fire lines to show up more obviously on the map, so we can see when there's a fire when it initially starts, if there's already been work done around the allotments, and make better decisions on which fires to allow to burn. So that remote piece, I think, in a perfect world, we get better at tracking fire lines and fuels treatments and treating them like they're worked on the landscape instead of separate projects, I guess. And so we can make better decisions. If we can allow those fires to burn, then it's treating the fuels and the landscape, which BIA isn't really managing the landscape, but our partners are. And the other part of the perfect world, the tribal interests, I think these AKSA lands have been a challenge for a long time. They're not BI's responsibility, but oftentimes the tribe has an interest in them, and they're all intermingled with other ownerships. And so these bilateral or bipartisan infrastructure law projects that are going to come out for the next 5 years, and this reserve treaty rights lands program, we can involve the tribes and have them articulate what their needs are, insert them along, whether it's habitat or access to their fish camp, whatever it is that's important to them, and incorporate that with the vegetation treatment. And I guess it's also breaking down the fuels word, things that meet the needs of the people, along with supporting the firefighting effort, I guess, is what my mind has for the perfection.
Yeah, for forestry, it's pretty basic. The point of our fuels program is to protect communities, which is our mission. Protect Alaskans and communities and infrastructure. So that's mainly what we're working on. We're trying to build these fuel breaks around communities to protect them from an approaching fire, and that's what we've been working on. In terms of a perfect fuels project, money is no object. That's a tough one. I mean, it's obviously it's going to be something that, like I said, is going to protect the community, and it also has to have public support. We want it to look aesthetically pleasing if possible, and for the public to embrace it. Fuel breaks can be like a landfill or a prison. Everybody thinks they're a good idea, but they don't necessarily want them in their backyard. So when you talk about putting a 300-foot wide clear cut, visible from somebody's house, that doesn't a lot of times cut it. They don't want that until there is a fire bearing down on their house, and then it's a different story. But so I guess a perfect fuels project for us would be something that, that provides protection to a community or a group of homes and a subdivision and that has public support from the players that are impacted by that fuel break. And also part of it is, providing, has an economical benefit to the community or Alaska, where maybe if it's a village that some of the local work can be done by the community to provide income for those folks who stay in Alaska, or whether it's hiring a contractor to do that work so that money again is being invested in the local economy.
Thanks, Tim. And yeah, thanks, Jeremy. This is a complex kind of question. Could write a dissertation on it, I think. But just to put it in perspective, I guess a little bit, the way I think is that fuels treatments in Alaska don't follow boundaries. We all have different agencies up here, but to me, I don't see lines in the sand as where we should stop fuel treatments. For the BLM side of things and Alaska Fire Service, we look at protecting the resource on the ground out there, wildlife habitat, whatever it may be, but also community values out there. So if it's AKSA lands, allotments, or anything like that out there, then that's where we look at quick fuel treatments. We also look at the risk out there and risk versus reward. So the best place to put a fuels treatment that you're going to actually get a reward out of it. So that kind of goes into your last question of where, if there's no money, people, if you could have the perfect world where the fuels treatment would be, and to me, it would be a usable multi-agency, large type of fuel break that surrounds the community or values, connecting the dots across the agencies. Like Tim said, in most cases in Alaska, it's a large fuel break. To be able to be a sustainable fuel break and be usable when you have fire running at you, when to burn off of it or do whatever you need to do. Really the best fuel break out there. However, even shaded fuel break or anything out there that provides firefighters more of a safe option to work off of, even if it's access to the fire. That's definitely a benefit. That I think just protecting whatever values are out there, and also putting in fuel breaks to allow for natural fire in the landscape to burn. And look at projects out there where bordering a critical area, management area, or some sort of values that would put a fuel break in there and allow fire to do more natural things on the lands outside of that area. So kind of a multi-tier, multi-agency approach.
May have forgot some of your questions. It's been a while since you said it. I'll repeat it. I think I mentioned how our fuels program supports our training mission. And then we implement prescribed fires on our grassy fuel types where we have high probability of military starts to reduce fire danger. Around our point protection item sites, we got about 200 of them across our 1.5 million acres. Fire-wise, basically thinning projects, and then where we want our boundaries or between different management options, where we allow fire to kind of do what it wants to do and where we want to put it out. Those big fuel break lines that people have mentioned previously. It's kind of also a gradation of cost, right? Because those shaded fuel breaks cost the most, and their cheapest is probably prescribed fire. That's not always feasible. And then those big mechanical fuel breaks, that goes fuel breaks. So integrating your economics, kind of where you're placing these items across the landscape. Our ideal fuel break systems are integrating all that, as I just mentioned. Putting the right fuel break where it needs to be, weighing cost, weighing its effectiveness, allow fire to work on the landscape as the oil system needs. Working with your partners, especially across your agency boundaries. Say that's probably it. The challenge, Army's fuel break systems are fairly, we've been doing this for a while. Other agencies less as long as we have been. So maintenance is a challenge, how to schedule that in, how to track funds. A lot of times you track funds to put things in because people like shiny objects, but then you can't track the funds to maintain them. What is your maintenance plan? Kind of feel that's where we're going to go as these fuel breaks mature across our landscape. Yeah. So the question from Mike Goyette, from the Delta Junction area, which is an agricultural area and the largest in the state, was could agencies look at leasing portions of their fuel breaks to agricultural users for maintenance? In Alaska, so I'm a farmer, the agricultural season is pretty short, and leasing is challenging because you have your own ground that you're going to farm first in your priority structure, and then somebody else's ground you'll farm next. Or a window for haying systems or something like that is so narrow, and the logistics of moving equipment timely, I think, would be quite challenging, and there are not a lot of agricultural people around. So usually people are farming their own ground when they can, and that's what they're working at. Livestock systems could be entertained, but then we're just not used to that in Alaska. You basically have to have sort of a shepherded system where somebody would be with the livestock to ensure its protection. It's actually things we've talked about on Army lands. We have large drop zones where parachuters drop on grass and fields. And why couldn't you hay that? Well, you certainly could, or you could graze the system. That is something the Army nationwide actually has programs for that. We have ag outlease programs that lease grounds for that very purpose, particularly in the Midwest states and the Southeast U.S. We've asked farmers in the Alaska area, but we run into that window. They're busy farming their ground, and that short window to hay, that they're not going to be able to move onto Army land to farm, and they certainly don't want to invest in the high fertilizer costs if their crop got wrecked because all of a sudden the paratrooper brigade from Anchorage tromped everything down. And our mission is first, and so in our ag leases it states that you could have loss. That's kind of a long answer. I think somebody could research using agriculture for fuel break maintenance. There might be certain windows where that would work, particularly small animal grazing, goats and sheep. But demand for those animals are increasing in the state. There's not the capacity to grow those type of animals to meet demand, so there's potential there.
Okay. For Fish and Wildlife Service, how does the local fuels program support the overarching mission of the agency? I think it comes back to what I started talking about, and it's the relationships with your neighbors and your partners. And we're up north up here and down by the Kenai. You know, our fuels project, we're getting good work done on the ground. That's a viable, hopefully a viable fuels treatment, but also we're collaborating. We're working with the village of Fort Yukon, for instance, with Beaver. And that kind of inspires just building those relationships. And that's a way to do it. So rather than the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service coming in, you know, law enforcement capacity, maybe writing someone a ticket for a illegal moose harvest, that leaves a bad taste in people's mouth. And then I get that, but maybe we come in and do some fuels work into a village and employ some people. And that's a good thing. That's a positive. We hopefully help the community be a little more resilient to fire, and we provide some income to those folks. In my mind, that's probably our best foot forward in Alaska as far as our fuels goes. The values we're trying to protect vary from managers. Certainly are the villages that are within our kind of our shadow. Certainly we want to respect them and the lands that they utilize. And fire might be, Fish and Wildlife Service might have a tolerance for fire. And that's cool as long as the fire stays on the Fish and Wildlife Service, right? But fire doesn't do that, obviously. So we have to be cognizant of maybe our philosophy is different than other philosophy. Maybe our tolerance for fire is different. Easy answers, we protect you know, our public use cabins, which we do. And that's tangible. You can kind of like, oh yeah, there's a cabin, you guys protected it, good job. Some of the other stuff is pretty complicated. The fuels that the values that we, you know, just stop on this. The values that we protect kind of vary from manager to manager. So, you know, if you go to Fish and Wildlife Service FMO school, they're going to tell you you're doing this all for the habitat. This is a natural process. This is good for, this is part of the ecological system that's in place. And that got us by for a long time. And now we have some managers maybe questioning that, maybe saying we're a little out of what is natural. Some refuge managers they've had their fill of fire on the landscape. They think we've entered an unnatural cycle. So kind of depends on where you're going.
See, for the National Park Service, our values that we're protecting, or the reasons for our fuels treatments, is that we're trying to give the decision space. So if we do a fuels treatment, we're hoping to have the decision space to be able to allow natural fire to play its role in the landscape. So whether it's protecting allotments like Tom brought up, or whether it's our infrastructure, or whether it's a cultural resource site, that's usually the intent of our fuels treatments. And I guess that kind of falls into the values that we're protecting as well. There definitely was a pretty big push recently to focus on infrastructure. So we did a lot of surveys to figure out where all the mapping and doing this process of evaluating all of the structures that we have out there. And some of the parks, we have a lot of structures. They may not be, I think Wrangell, St. Elias alone, it's a 14 million acre park, has over probably 600 structures scattered, structured sites. And that's just because of the history of that park. And so trying to figure out where everything is, mapping it, and figuring out where we need to actually do fuels treatments in those areas. I think we have, less so than the Fish and Wildlife Service. We don't have a lot of communities that are right adjacent or in our parks, but we do have a lot of allotments. And so I think protecting those is important. um, from the standpoint of what would be the ideal fuels treatment if we had all the money, and along like other people said, we are expecting to see increases in our fuels budgets coming up, and we've already seen some. And I think that we're going to start needing to move into more of a prescribed fire scenario potentially. I don't know how we'll pull it off, but I think the ideal is that we would have a fuels treatment that is kind of bomber proof enough that we feel comfortable to allow fire to roll into it, something that we don't have to worry about. And then we've also communicated that those efforts to our neighbors, our communities, to the public, so they understand why are we continuing to have limited fires, because we've also been able to do this type of a fuels project. I don't know what our ideal is, but I think we need to probably start moving into a bigger footprint for our fuels work, and I think we will.
Private landowner perspective, well, protecting my property, generating firewood and wildlife habitat. So that's where I'm at. I don't really have a capacity to grow because I am the owner operator. So that's kind of where I'm at. And then I can only burn so much firewood without it rotting. So that's my capacity. But as I look, across the neighborhood, I'm just one owner in a sea, and I think that's where the challenge is at. And that's the entities that can work with private property owners. We talk. The agency work is kind of simple. From a relatively long, they're in big government lands, so they kind of just deal with themselves internally, and they can build these big projects. But working with diversified private landowners is challenging. It's hard to get the acres, but I encourage NRCS and state forestry, do what you can do. I mean, that's vital work. When you're one landowner surrounded by many, you have one small little effect. But together, I think it can be cooperative working a lot more effective on the landscape and managing wildfire in the community.
Yeah, Dan, that's a really good point, and I agree with you completely. And I think between our fuels program and our stewardship program, they are starting to look more at like the road service area level. And so hopefully, as you know, working with individual landowners at that scale can be more difficult, but that's certainly a goal. I did want to add a couple things for the division. Like Tim and I have already said, the big value that we are trying to protect are communities and individual private landowners and firefighters. Those are our primary values. And so when we have fuel breaks, we want them to be functional, and we want firefighters to be able to go in and out, equipment to be able to go in and out safely. But the one thing that I think like an ideal fuel break would have, at least from my perspective, would be a use for the material that comes off of the fuel break. And I'm a forester, and I want to use that material for something. And that's not an easy thing to do in Alaska. We don't have markets for small diameter material. Even our biomass markets can't take that material. There's one example where that can work and has worked is in Tok, which everybody knows is the center of the universe. In Tok, we are actually able to, with the school biomass project there, we have been able to function to develop fuel breaks and use that material in that school's boiler. So, I think building up some kind of, this is not an easy thing to do, obviously, but identifying markets for that material would be ideal from my perspective. And it's something that some effort needs to continue to be made towards, and it has been made. People have been trying to figure, this is a tough nut to crack. People have been trying to figure it out for a long time, but it's something that we need to continue to try to work on. Okay, so moving on to the next. Okay.
Thanks. And this has to do with fuel breaks on public lands, but primarily on the borough lands where a lot of fuel breaks are going in. Subsequently to fuel breaks being established, the boroughs in some cases have been, one of their objectives is to sell their lands into private ownership. And several instances I can think of here in Fairbanks North Star Borough, fuel breaks now have a tourist destination located in one. Yurts, I believe, are in one of the fuel breaks. And another project has a large shaded fuel break going in around the subdivision that then the 36 acres right below that are scheduled for sale. So how do you maintain that fuel break? Or what kind of planning considerations would you guys suggest from a planning standpoint that should be potentially put in place to ensure these high expensive investments are maintained in the future?
For the borough land, I guess I'll start there and we can open it up to the room. There's some people in the room that might have ideas too, but some kind of an easement is going to be needed to maintain those fuel breaks. In the instance that you're talking about with the yurts, that fuel break being sold into private land, I guess agreements need to be put in place, but we need to continue to have easements to be able to maintain those fuel breaks. And that's a process that is difficult with the borough. I mean, we try to get easements just to access our own land, and when we have difficulties working through that process. So it's a reality, but I think to some perspective, easements or conservation easements, something needs to be agreed to.
Well, I guess my opinion is largely driven by spending most of my career at BLM, and there's a lot of small parcels like around in Fairbanks area and other urban areas that I think are just these nasty woodlots, and when the fires are the problems. A lot of times it's land status isn't static, and there's these selected lands out there by the native corporations in the state of Alaska, and they're not all going to convey, and people have used that as an excuse to not deal with pieces of land. And so I guess in a perfect world, to me as a taxpayer, there just needs to be a certain tolerance for loss of fuels treatments in some cases. And an easement is a great idea if you can get to that community planning level, but it's the last frontier, right? I don't know if that's going to happen during our careers.
I can just add one thing, and Jeremy, you hit the nail on the head. It is a tough nut to crack, because say when we get federal funds from the Forest Service, we can't use those to maintain a fuel break. We can use them to put in a fuel break, but maintenance is a different issue. So funding comes into play. Is who's going to provide that funding. And like Chris mentioned, the borough is looking at using those fuel breaks to generate revenue. And there just needs to be a mechanism, a funding mechanism for maintaining those fuel breaks like we are currently doing on the old Murphy Dome fuel break. That's the maintenance is a big issue. It's great to put these fuel breaks in, but we've seen where we have reburns and how regularly they occur. So once you get 10 or 15 years, those fuel breaks, how effective are they at that point as a fuel break without maintenance? So maintenance is a huge issue.
Fuel breaks and maintenance. So the Army has maybe a little different approach. Army Department of Defense lands are kind of like a small community of themselves. So fuel breaks in our world are real property. What does real property mean? So roads are real property. So they can be maintained with real property maintenance infrastructure funds. So I think if there was an ability for fuel breaks to be considered as real property and have value in and of themselves, and then funds to be programmed, much like DOT programs funds for road maintenance, pothole filling, or what have you. Considered in that approach that it's a value on the landscape and has value, and you want to maintain that value as long as that property serves public need. That's the way to approach it.
Any other questions? Sue?
Hi, this is Sue Rodman from the Department of Fish and Game. And I just want to kind of tag off of a couple things that you guys were saying when you say ideal fuel break. We've been talking about this for a couple of years. Well, can we combine a fuel break with a habitat enhancement project? And I know that oftentimes is kind of it happens anyway because of how we're treating something and what we're treating. And I think there's more opportunities to do that. And one of them is what Tim just mentioned, like maintenance of fuel breaks. Where we work, we're always getting requests from people, communities, hunters to make moose hunting more available in road systems or trail systems, places where people can get to. And those are often the places that are outside of communities. And so I think there's a lot more opportunities to do stuff together and with Fish and Game and with the other agencies. And I know we've done a whole bunch of cool things. So it's not like we haven't started this, but I think there are more places where we can work together and fulfill some of the other needs of Alaskans. And I know some of you are moose hunters, so and grouse hunters. So anyway, I just want to keep that idea out there that we can support with some of those other like outlier problems that we're experiencing as land managers or fire managers, you know, in the case of like maintenance or coordinating with communities. And we want to support that kind of stuff and make it so that we're kind of expanding off these field breaks. And you know, Fish and Game contributed quite a bit to the Sterling field break over the last few years. We just finished the west corner at Siska Lake, and we worked with a lot of the tribal entities with Siri and Salamatov, and that was great because now they have potentially some hunting lands or some hunting forage areas where it can be improved. So there are opportunities out there, and I think we can expand on those more.
Mike Goyette here. Sue and I have been working quite a bit in Delta Junction area with habitat, with the roller chopper, fishing game roller chopper, and forestry. Those are with that. Most of it is aspen and hardwoods, but when we go in, we're actually making access into those areas. That access is also fire access. Granted, it is limited depending on weather conditions, but the staging area for the equipment while we're working out there actually becomes an LD for habitat vehicle land, which gets them closer to any fire that might be in those areas as well.
And the Spruce Islands at Delta have a half a mile of grass around them.
Thanks, Sue. Was not aware of that.
Yeah, half a mile of grass. Looks beautiful. And so I just wanted to add to what Sue was saying. Then I think we do miss the opportunity to say that fuel breaks and some hazardous fuels treatments that we do a big habitat improvement out there. As a landowner as well, we have a fuel break that we cut around our house, and hardwoods have grown in, and deciduous trees, mainly spruce and birch and aspen. And I think that helped the moose this winter make it through this winter. They couldn't have come out there the entire winter. So yeah, I think we missed the opportunity to call them what they are. They're fuel break, but there's also some sort of habitat improvement in that as well.
Yeah, I do want to take a moment to ask if any folks online have any questions. If you don't want to put it in the chat, you're more than welcome to unmute yourself and raise your hand or anything and ask some questions. But moving on to the next topic here, want to jump to number 7. So with this national focus on fuels and fire mitigation, I think we touched on it a little bit earlier, but there's a big expectation that we as agency folks get things done immediately. We all have planning processes and we have to build up capacity to be able to meet these. I guess the question is how has this new expectation or this new national focus on fuels if it is new? How has it impacted your agency? And do you feel like there has been an expectation to get things done more quickly? We'll start over in the Park Service.
So we've seen some increase in funding. I do think that we're going to be expected to have more target acres completed with funding. And there's going to be a lot of reporting, and there's going to be a lot of expectations of increased productivity. But we run into, and this is one of your other questions about, how long does it take to get boots on the ground to implement? And if it takes 1 to 2 years to get through compliance and planning, and you have the cultural resource person go out and check out all the areas that you want to do this fields work. And we also do monitoring, so trying to get something in front of where we're going to treat. I don't think that we're set up to suddenly go from a pretty small program to producing huge acres. And I don't know that our agency is expecting Alaska to be the big producer, but I do think that they're going to be looking at some of the other regions within the Park Service to say, okay, we need your acres completed. And we need more because we just got a bunch of money. So I think it's going to be a challenge. I think it's going to be a challenge from a compliance standpoint, and to get people on board within the park system and within the communities. Well, maybe not communities, but the parks themselves to be used to bigger projects going on.
Yeah, I think I'll dovetail into that, and it's probably similar for all the DOI agencies. But so a lot of money. I spoke about the fuels module that's being stood up down in the Kenai. That'll be in Alaska, Fish and Wildlife Service resource, but they will be housed at the Kenai. So that's new, and that's a direct result of this influx of money. As far as the expectation management piece of that, there's already starting to be pressure associated with this money from Boise, our folks in Boise saying, are you sure you don't need this? What about this piece of equipment out, in the boreal forest? And this happens, happened 20 years ago where there's this big slug of money comes in, and people start feeling this urgent need to spend it, to balance it out, not leave anything on the books, because I guess in their mind it might look bad. Well, that sometimes leads to poor decision making, and I fear like we're flirting with that, pretty regularly. I'll have to field a question from Boise, and it's apparent that they are struggling to get rid of a bunch of money.
Well, I'm in the Department of Defense, so I'm not really seeing an influx of any money related to fuels work. I think it's more Department of Interior and Agriculture. State. Some people claim that we do what we can do.
To answer that, I would say kind of. And so we feel, at least for the BLM, I'm sure all the DOI just kind of feel a little bit the same. We feel a lot of pressure from the Washington office on get stuff done quickly. We're giving you all this money. We want you to produce quickly. And I think it's just not, they just don't understand what it takes. And so from our national office in Boise, from NIPSI, the National Organic Fire Center, our direction there is basically, build what you have to. It takes time. They know it takes time. It's a systematic approach, for especially if you have to hire positions there. They also know that if you're getting pressured to get stuff done, mistakes happen. You can also damage some long-term relationships in that pressure to get things done. And so they realize that and recognize it, kind of have pushed that down through the states in that sense. That being said, though, there is there it definitely is an expectation to get more done. It's not going to be that you got to get it done quick. We're looking at, even we got the kind of the go ahead this year to spend the money to hire positions where we normally wouldn't use that money to hire positions, to do so to set us up for the future. So it's kind of more or less building, kind of pressure to build your organization to get work done. And it's the direction down from our fire director employees has been different. Even a kind of example for that, I did go to a escape fire review, and the direction that came down from the national office was to see if they are feeling pressure to get this work done, and that was may have what caused the escape to occur, and that was not the case. They didn't feel that pressure. So. And I try not to push that down to my folks. I think some of them probably feel that a little bit when I'm trying to pressure them to hire positions to get this done and put this out for contract, but I'm trying not to do that too much. Kind of.
Yeah, from the state perspective, definitely. It's impacted our division, and there are expectations that come along with the money that's being provided at the state level. Like I said earlier, we're still in the process of hiring multiple positions to really build up our fuels program. And both at the commissioner and the governor's level, they want to see results now. And there's an education process. I mean, when I left, we were providing the commissioner and the governor's office a weekly update on our fuels projects or a specific fuels project, because there's this perception, okay, we gave you X million dollars of money, where's the fuel break? Without understanding that it takes not as long as at the federal level and the state level, but it takes a couple of years before you're going to be cutting any fuel breaks. I mean, you got to map them out, you go through a public process, and it's not like flipping a switch that you can just put a fuel break in. There's a lot of work and planning that goes into it, and so you sort of have to try to educate the powers that be that that's the case. And yeah, you gave us $5 million, but and like both Casey and Brian said, when you have this urgency and this expectation to spend that money, mistakes and bad decisions are made, and you end up wasting money. And that's what, as Brian alluded to, that's what I fear could be happening with this big slug of money that we're getting, is that people are going to feel the urgency to get things done and just to spend that money to get it off the books, whereas if people could just sit down and think about it in the long term and like what's best for the state, what's best for the agency, what's best for the public, and make those decisions. I think that's critical because there's, in my eyes, there's definitely an expectation that comes along with this increased funding. And how long are we going to be getting this funding? We're adding a bunch of positions, we're adding a fuels program, and because there's this national push for fuels work, is that funding going to be available 5 or 10 years from now when we've got these positions hired? I mean, it's like building a road. You build that road, but then you have to maintain it. And maybe you can't use federal dollars to maintain that road. You have to use state dollars. So it's a big part of what's happening now. And I think, yeah, I think it's I think we're walking a thin line as far as what those expectations are and the decisions that are going to be made to get stuff done and how quickly that happens.
How are we doing on time? Yeah, there's a lot of pressure to get stuff done, and it's like in the early 2000s, the same thing happened, and then funds dwindled, and so I guess I feel like even though their pressure might be a negative, it's also a positive. Like strike while the iron's hot, we have an opportunity. Get some treatments out there on the ground if they're not 100% perfect, learn from it, and use this additional workforce that we're creating to build some long-term plans. I'm hopeful that this afternoon we'll talk more about that. Like, I'm intrigued by these ideas of like Sue talking about her spruce with a half mile of grass? Like how much of a fuel break do we have to put in to allow more fire in closer? Or could we claim those acres? You know, if we do an expensive treatment near the community and then we are allowed to put fire in near it. Is that part of the program? And BLM will sure let you do that. I don't know if other agencies do that. My allotments are tiny, so I'm never gonna win it. But yeah, anyway, I hope we keep talking about it and use this money as much good as we can.
Okay, so I am shooting for 10:15 here. So we got a few more minutes. I'm gonna just ask one question. It's gonna be short answers. It's directed at Dan in his private landowner role, Tom in his allotment role, and then Tim just as a PIO and dealing with the public. So it's the last question. Private land ownership can present challenges in meeting ownership objectives related to fuels. As a result, most work is focused on public land near private property or subdivisions. From your perspective, what would be needed to incentivize private landowners or allottees to participate in fuels work on their land? I'm going to start with Dane.
Well, we alluded to earlier, it's difficult working with private property owners. Everybody has different land management, land owner objectives. And there's a lot of different parcel sizes and that can be done. I think, you know, the entities that could work with private property owners we just keep plodding along. It's going to be kind of low interest, and then an incident will happen, and then there's high interest, and to maximize on that opportunity. That's kind of historically what I've seen, and I don't see a real difference in that, unless there is sort of some external force on private property owners, like insurance rates or something that makes people feel obligated to do some work. But it's important work on along. There's monetary incentives, I guess. Firewise programs are paid. I did not participate in Firewise, but my monetary incentive was $360 an acre. We're basically doing a thinning, shaded fuel break, and pile burn. So that probably paid for my sawgrass fruit. So you know, there's different. I don't know that the money is really going to do it. Getting people interested in the work and why to do it in the greater good for the community. Probably emphasize that. A few little parcels, probably not going to do a lot in the greater community. Just trying to achieve 50% something. Start to have an effect on the landscape. Just keep at it.
Money does work. I mean, for our stewardship program, they had WUI grants. They've had several programs where they've had WUI grants made available to the public to cut down trees around their properties, and those were hugely popular. You know, where people are getting, they can cut down the trees themselves, or they can hire a contractor to do it. They're being reimbursed. They can keep the firewood. So those have been hugely popular. I think Dan mentioned it. You know, emphasizing the good it's going to do the community, whether it's a subdivision or a town. You know, and getting those folks on board. And he also mentioned, yeah, that a lot of people aren't interested until there's smoke in the air and there's fire bearing down on them. And so there you have to strike while the iron's hot, you know, and try to get people involved. And whether it's becoming a Firewise community. I mean, in Alaska, we have, you know, we hear Firewise all the time. It's a buzzword, but we have 3 Firewise communities in the state. And that's it. And it's really, it's not the agency that is going to do that. It's the public, and it's educating the public as to why the benefits of doing that, why they should do that. And once, it's like a lot of other things, once you get some people involved and you get some momentum, it becomes a lot easier, and it becomes a lot easier after a big fire season, or even during a big fire season. where the public is much more willing to listen to the benefits of this when they're smelling smoke in the air and they're being told that they might have to evacuate their homes. So it's a real challenge. It's just a continuing educational effort to try to get people on board. Like I said, they hear Firewise, but how many people are actually partaking that? I cannot tell you how many times during an incident, I'm fielding calls from the public, and they're saying, "I got to get to my property, cut some trees down." You know, it's like, well, it's like the hotshot crews. There's a saying, and I'll probably screw it up, but like they'll tell people, "We can't do in 20 minutes what you had 20 years to do." And so we try to tell the public when a fire's in your area and crews are looking at, you know, potentially saving houses, they pull into your place and there's not a place to turn around and there's black spruce surrounding your house, they're going to go right by it. They're just going to go to the next one that they think is defensible because it's just going to be a waste of time to try to save that house when there are other houses that are more prepared to do that. So yeah, I don't know if that answers the question.
Does that mean 20 minutes? Okay. Well, so native allotments are not private property. They have a restricted title, and so they're restricted from taxation, and they're supposed to be protected in perpetuity by the federal government. BIA is charged with making that happen. So it's a little bit tricky. They can have multiple allottees. They can certainly, if all the allottees agree, they can convert it to fee simple private land, and then DNR can be the jurisdiction. And then they just are private land. But yeah, I think land managers who have lands adjacent to allotments and want to have more fire on the landscape have been successful in putting together some projects. I think if we can hire some more BIA folks, I'll try and put in a little more planning effort to like potential fire line locations. Like a lot of times we could do a fields project that's not on the allotment. It could be a lot shorter, just connecting a couple of sloughs, and that's the give and take. And some of that we've done with the interagency fire management plan, but it's just going to be tricky. Like Congress came up with this allotment act in 1906 or whatever. These legacy kind of agreements that we didn't create still exist. I don't know if people know this, but Ed over there was a forester. If you're an allottee and you want to cut some trees down, you got to get a permit from BIA. Like you can't just go out there and do whatever you want. So it's not exactly private land. But I guess that's my spiel. It's difficult, and we have had some successes in building.
All right, well, I'd like to give the panel a round of applause, please. Thank you all for participating. It was a good discussion, and like Tom said, hopefully we can continue to have it. So I think we've got a 15-minute break now, and so we'll be back at 10:30.